Chess friends, today I am gonna teach you how you can defend against the so-called Italian opening, bishop and knight attack, which is played by 9.3 million players according to Lichess database. I'm going to show you a special chess move that can beat really good players, even those with a high rating of 2500, in just 10 moves. They'll be checkmated in a very common opening that a lot of beginners use, especially in the two knights game, right after white plays bishop c4, knight f6. Many of your opponents, actually most of them, will target your epsilon pawn. They're aiming for what's called the fried liver attack. After we move d5 to block the diagonal, white takes the pawn. That's when we'll surprise your opponent. Your opponents usually expect you to move knight takes d5, hoping for that, but we won't do that. Because if you play knight takes d5, it leads to the fried liver attack with knight takes f7, which forces your king out, and then comes queen f3, a double attack, putting black in big trouble quickly. That's what your opponent wants, but we're going to avoid that. Let's go back and think of a different move. Instead of making the losing move knight takes d5, the usual move is knight takes a5, which has a lot of theory behind it and has been played in thousands of games. It's a complex path. But we're going to choose a riskier yet more rewarding move, knight d4. At first glance, it might seem like we're ignoring white's main plan to attack our weak f7 square, so, in this position, white might push the d6 pawn to open up the diagonal, bringing the threat back into play. It seems like black is in a tough spot with limited options. However, the strategy here is to act as if you either missed the threat or couldn't find a way to deal with it, and simply capture the pawn. Can you guess the most common move here, even by skilled players? It's knight takes f7, attacking both the queen and the rook. At first, it seems like black is done for, about to lose a rook for nothing, but, in reality, things are completely different. Actually, black is in a winning position here, but it's not obvious unless you're ready for it, and many opponents won't be. The move to play is queen c6. This small step to the right puts huge pressure on white's game. It's a bit odd, but it turns out to be a very powerful move in the opening. So, what's the idea here? You're hitting targets in different places. You're threatening the pawn and then the bishop on c4. The bishop can't just pull back because it needs to protect the knight on f7, which is under pressure too. Plus, there's a kind of indirect threat to the c2 pawn, since your knight from d4 is also applying pressure. Just because of all the mistakes they've made, you can tell white is in trouble. They just can't deal with all these threats. Most of the time, they'll take the rook, since that was the whole point of their last move. Next, you capture the pawn on g2, setting up queen takes h1, which almost checkmates. White can only save the rook with rook f1, but then, you check the king with queen e4. The typical response is bishop e2, but then you deliver knight f3, and that's checkmate in 10 moves. Just like I said before, even players rated 2400 to 2500, and of course, those at lower levels, get checkmated in this very common opening. All within 10 moves. It's amazing, right? Yes, it is, but we should also be aware of other moves our opponents might try, and let me share a quote quickly with you. If you want to be a leader who attracts quality people, the key is to become a person of quality. So let's quickly review them. If we rewind to the crucial 10th move, right after we play queen c6 and pile up the pressure on white, there's more than just knight takes h8, which we've seen leads to a stunning loss, with queen takes g2 and then a swift checkmate. If your opponent is sharp enough to see the threat, they might just castle, thinking it'll keep their king safe, and it kind of does, but then we begin to take their pieces, starting with the bishop. White might capture our rook with the knight, which seems good for them at first, but then, our pawn can move forward, and it will be taken by either the king or queen, so, the knight ends up trapped there, and in most situations, you'll capture it eventually. You could castle queenside to take it, among other strategies. At this point, you have many strong moves available. For instance, playing knight takes c2 outright wins the rook on a1, as it can't escape. Oddly, the most common move for white in this position is knight a3. A move that doesn't seem to achieve much, because you're not looking to exchange your knight there, right? You've got better options, so, you just swap off the bishop instead, and after that trade, you capture the rook. This leaves white's knight still in a bad spot. You would typically play moves like bishop e6, castle queenside, and eventually your rook will capture the knight on h8. You might even consider moving your king with kf8, then king g8, to take the knight. The key point is that the knight has no escape route. Following this strategy, you end up with a substantial material lead, putting you in a completely winning position. Okay, let's review this one more time and see what other moves your opponents might try. We're sticking with knight f6, the two knights game, targeting the pawn. Often, your opponents will play knight g5. Just a small note here, many opponents also go for a symmetric move, knight c3, which might seem solid but is actually a mistake. Black has a strategy to exploit this, often leading to a winning position. Alright, now let's get back to the so-called fried liver attack, or at least the attempt to launch one against you. We're not capturing, instead, we move knight d4, white may try to revive their threat with d6, but we happily take the bait, knowing knight f7 won't work because of our c6 move, creating multiple threats. Another question might be, what happens if the bishop takes on f7 instead of the knight? In that case, we respond with king e7, and white's pieces remain unstable. You aim to play h6, to push the knight away and capture the bishop. Therefore, the bishop must move, but where to? If it retreats to c4, it falls into the same trap as before with queen c6, targeting the bishop and the pawn. There's also an interesting scenario where if white tries to save the situation by moving the bishop back to f1, it still doesn't work because of the threat against the c2 pawn, leading to knight takes c2. After knight takes c2, it's check to the king, and king e2 becomes the only move for white. You could easily take the rook, but a more amusing line is playing h6, challenging the knight. When the knight retreats, you proceed with queen e4. Achieving a precise and neat checkmate right in the center of the board. It's interesting to see how white transitions from one problem to another in various branches of this opening, and let me tell you a quote about life. Maybe you have to know the darkness before you can appreciate the light. So, moving the bishop back to c4 just leads back to the troubles caused by queen c6, the same old issues. If the bishop retreats to b3 for safety, it's definitely a safer and better option for white, but you still maintain a strong attack. White's pieces are largely undeveloped, with most of them remaining on the first rank. Plus, the knight on g5 becomes more of a liability because you can continuously attack it. Forcing it to retreat, you can attack once more with a4, and later on, you can consider playing bishop g4 to put pressure on the white queen, making white feel uneasy. If the knight moves to h4, you need to be cautious about potential threats like forks. However, this isn't a big issue since you were planning to play king f7 to keep your king safe and improve your bishop's position. Adding to white's existing difficulties, there's also the trapped knight on the rim, as we've discussed. Now, I'm planning to play g5 to capture it because the knight has no safe retreat squares. White will have to find an escape route, but even if they play knight g2 after g5, the knight is safe. However, we can return to the bishop g4 idea, which then traps the queen with no escape squares, leading us to win the queen. It's not necessarily a dire situation for white. There are solutions available. However, it's important to note that the tempting move d6 is actually a mistake. A more challenging move for black is pawn to c3, and it's crucial to know how to respond in this situation. My suggestion is to continue with an aggressive approach and keep up the attack because, well, why not enjoy the game? Instead of retreating, you can counterattack by playing pawn to b5. In this scenario, white has the option to either retreat their bishop or recapture your knight. Let's proceed from this point. This situation involves several exchanges where pieces are taken back and forth. Now, white captures a piece, takes pawn, the knight is under attack. And instead of moving the knight, a stronger move is queen takes d5. The queen becomes an active participant in the game, exerting influence in various directions. Consequently, white likely needs to capture the queen. Now, queen takes g5 is played, and white continues capturing, which is the most common response. Bishop takes g7 is a noteworthy move in this position. Initially, if white castles, it might appear that black is in trouble with an open king and weak pawns. However, the reality is different, and black is actually winning due to superior activity on the board. After playing bishop to b7, the threats against white's king become highly potent. making it difficult for white to defend. Your position benefits from open lines and diagonals, allowing for continuous attacks. Additionally, there's the possibility of bringing your rook to the g-file later on, further enhancing your attacking prospects. The point of your piece on c4 also restricts white's advancement options, contributing to your advantageous position. In this situation, black is actually in a completely winning position, despite any initial thoughts white may have about having an advantage. Now, white's primary concern is preventing the threat of queen to g2 checkmate. In the game, black played bishop d4 check, and after white castled to h1, black's queen is preparing to move to rook g8, setting up a checkmate over the g-file. However, white played d3, employing a clever tactic. After the discovered attack with d3, the queen retreats, nullifying the immediate threat. Now, after pawn takes, playing rook to g8 creates a powerful threat of queen takes g2. Alternatively, black could consider playing bishop to b2, targeting the white queen, which would be overwhelmingly advantageous for black due to the strong attack. In the game, after queen to e2, black played rook to e8, once again targeting the queen and aiming to capture the pawn to secure a win. After white's move queen to d2, let's make this our puzzle of the day and analyze the position further. It's black's turn to move. Take your time to think about your move. If you're not sure about the winning move, you can write it down in the comments below. The variation we discussed earlier was quite long, and it's not necessary to memorize it. What's more helpful is understanding common strategies and ideas. In this position, I would suggest a more conservative approach for white. Instead of diving into a crazy line where pieces are captured left and right after c3 attacking the knight and black counterattacks with pawn b5, it's wiser for white to simply retreat the bishop. The issue for black here is that their knight is under attack, and if it moves, white can capture the pawn on b5, so, instead of backing down, we continue our attack with knight takes d5, which creates a discovered attack. Now, after pawn takes, we play queen takes g5, making our position very active. We can then pick up the pawn, forcing white's king to move, resulting in a chaotic position. For instance, if white castles, we can play bishop b7. We've previously discussed this concept of aligning against the pawn, potentially putting pressure on it. This assessment is based on the assumption that the opponent can consistently make perfect defensive moves over a long period of time. The line that the computer suggests is quite complex and challenging for an average chess player to find. Therefore, white needs to be cautious. A more natural move, like pawn to d3 to target the queen, may be a safer and more practical option. Indeed, playing pawn to d3 can lead to a swift defeat. After knight f4, white faces a critical threat as the queen can now move to g2 with support from the knight and bishop. Even if white tries pawn to g3, attempting to block the queen's access, there's another unexpected checkmate with knight h3. It's important to note that the bishop controls certain squares, and the knight delivers the final checkmate. In theory, white can defend, but in practical games, attacking is often easier. Statistics show that black is doing well in this position. That was our today's chess video. I hope you enjoyed the content very well, and don't forget to like and subscribe to my channel. Wish you all the best. Bye bye, see ya.